James Harding stood in front of Whitmore Flour Mill with $460 in cash and the particular certainty that comes when a man has exhausted every reasonable option and arrived at desperation disguised as hope. The building rose 4 stories against the Montana sky, its weathered limestone walls stained gray by a century of grain dust and prairie storms, and every broken window reflected clouds moving fast enough to make him think of time running out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His son Connor sat in their truck, 9 years old and quiet in the way children get when they've learned that asking questions only makes their parents' worry visible. The county foreclosure auction had lasted 12 minutes. James had been the only bidder willing to take on a condemned flour mill with structural damage, asbestos concerns, and back taxes that accumulated like compound interest on borrowed time. $460, the auctioneer had said, sounding apologetic for accepting payments so small for a building that had once processed 1 million bushels of wheat annually. James had withdrawn his last $500 from the bank that morning, kept $40 for gas and groceries, and bet everything else on a building everyone assumed was worthless. His landlord had given him 2 weeks to vacate the trailer they'd been renting after the farm equipment dealership laid him off, said the space was needed for family, and besides, James was 4 months behind anyway. His job applications to every business within 60 miles had generated sympathy and silence in equal measure, and his ex-wife's lawyer had sent another letter about overdue child support that James couldn't read without his hands shaking. The mill had appeared in the legal notices between bankruptcy filings and tax lien sales. County seizure for unpaid obligations, minimum bid $400, sold as is with all encumbrances and liabilities. James had driven out to see it on a Wednesday afternoon, Connor doing homework in the passenger seat, and stood in the overgrown lot thinking about his grandfather who'd worked wheat harvest his whole life, who'd told stories about the great mills that had defined Montana agriculture before consolidation killed the small operators. The building had good bones, James thought, which was what people said about structures that had nothing else to recommend them. But the bones were solid, load-bearing walls 3 feet thick, timber joists from old-growth forests that didn't exist anymore, and a foundation that had withstood 100 years of freeze-thaw cycles and seasonal flooding from Cottonwood Creek. The roof needed work, the windows needed everything, and the interior was probably a disaster of broken equipment and contaminated grain dust. But it was space, more space than James had ever owned, and it was something he could maybe, possibly, with enough luck and work, turn into housing or storage or anything that would generate income. "Dad, it smells weird," Connor said as James unlocked the main entrance, the key provided by the county clerk who'd processed his payment with the efficient pity of someone who'd watched too many desperate people throw money at doomed properties. "Old grain," James said, though the smell was more complex than that, wheat and barley gone to rot, machine oil oxidized to varnish, and something organic that had been decaying in darkness for decades. The door opened onto a receiving area where farmers had once delivered their harvest, wooden floors still showing the tire tracks of trucks that hadn't driven here since the mill closed in 1987. The main floor was cavernous, dominated by equipment that rose toward shadows the afternoon light couldn't penetrate. Roller mills stood silent, their massive cylinders frozen with rust. Sifters hung suspended from the ceiling like industrial chandeliers, and conveyor systems traced paths through the space that spoke of efficiency optimized over generations. Canvas bags still hung from loading chutes, their fabric rotted to lace, and the wooden floor was covered with grain that had sprouted and died and fossilized into a carpet of failed germination. "Can we live here?" Connor asked, his voice small against the scale of the building. "Not yet. Not until we make it safe." James played his phone's flashlight over the equipment, noting details that told the story of the mill's final days. A clipboard still hung by what must have been the foreman's station, its paper too faded to read but its presence suggesting the shutdown had happened quickly. Work gloves sat on a windowsill, leather cracked with age. And throughout the space, grain had spilled and accumulated, creating drifts against walls and equipment bases like snow that never melted. They climbed to the second floor where the actual milling equipment stood, massive rollers that had crushed wheat into flour with the kind of mechanical violence that built empires. James recognized some of the machinery from his grandfather's stories: the purifier that separated flour from bran, the sifter that graded the result into different qualities. This equipment had once run 24 hours a day during harvest season, powered by steam engines and later electricity, producing flour that fed the Northwest and beyond. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The third floor held offices and what appeared to be a laboratory, spaces where quality control had happened, where the complex chemistry of turning grain into flour had been monitored and adjusted. Dusty bottles lined shelves, labeled with technical terms James only half understood. A microscope sat on a workbench, its brass fittings tarnished but intact. And on the wall hung a photograph in a heavy frame, showing a man in his 60s, well dressed in the style of the 1920s, standing in front of the mill's entrance. The brass plate below the photograph read, Augustus Whitmore, founder and proprietor, 1891 to 1954. "Who's that?" Connor asked, pointing at the stern-faced man whose expression suggested the kind of confidence that came from building something significant. "The person who started this mill. Long time ago." James continued exploring, finding a stairwell that led to the fourth floor. This level was different, smaller than the others, containing what had clearly been executive offices. The largest office must have belonged to Augustus Whitmore himself, a massive oak desk, leather chairs cracked with age, and windows that looked out over the creek and the wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. The desk still held items suggesting someone had walked away mid-task. A ledger lay open, its pages filled with columns of figures and precise handwriting. An ink blotter held the ghost imprint of writing James couldn't decipher. And on the wall behind the desk hung a portrait, oil on canvas, of the same man from the photograph, though older here, perhaps in his 70s, painted with the formality that successful men commission to ensure their legacy. "Dad, I'm hungry," Connor said, tugging at James's sleeve. James checked his phone, surprised to see they'd been inside for over 2 hours. The autumn light was fading, and he needed to figure out where they'd sleep tonight since the trailer was no longer available and the mill was legally uninhabitable. "Okay, buddy. Let's go." As he turned toward the door, his boot caught on something, a loose floorboard that shifted under his weight. James stumbled, caught himself on the desk, and looked down to see what he'd tripped over. The board had come completely loose, revealing a gap beneath, and in that gap, barely visible in the fading light, was an envelope, yellowed with age but sealed. James knelt and pulled out the envelope carefully. It was addressed in the same precise handwriting as the ledger, to the finder of this mill's secrets. Inside was a letter written on heavy paper that had somehow survived decades of temperature fluctuations and moisture, dated September 3, 1954. He read by the light of his phone, "To whomever discovers this, I am Augustus Whitmore, proprietor of Whitmore Flour Mill and all its holdings. What you have found is merely an introduction to what remains concealed within these walls. The agricultural crash of the 1920s destroyed many fortunes, but I learned from my father's mistakes and kept my wealth close, hidden in ways that will require both intelligence and determination to uncover. This mill contains the accumulated profit of 60 years of operation, secured against theft and decay. I leave this letter as proof and invitation. The map enclosed will guide you to greater treasures, but only if you possess the wit to interpret it correctly. Many will own this building after my death, but few will understand what it truly holds. May you prove worthy of the discovery." Augustus Whitmore. James read the letter 3 times, his hands starting to shake. A grain magnate's hidden fortune, concealed within the structure of a building everyone assumed was worthless. He searched the envelope again and found it tucked against the seam, a hand-drawn architectural diagram of the mill with certain sections marked in red ink. Notations in the margins referenced measurements, structural features, and cryptic phrases that might have been clues or might have been the writings of a paranoid old man. "What did you find?" Connor asked, peering at the envelope with curiosity. James looked at his son, at the worn shoes and the jacket getting too small, at the trust in his eyes that said he believed his father could fix their situation even when James wasn't sure he believed it himself. He thought about the $460 he'd just spent on a condemned building, about the 2 weeks they had before being homeless became official, about the desperate mathematics of single parenthood and economic collapse. And he thought about Augustus Whitmore, a man who'd built an empire on grain and flour, who'd survived the Depression by hiding his wealth where others wouldn't think to look, who'd left a puzzle for someone desperate or clever enough to solve. "I think," James said slowly, "I found a reason we might be okay." He carefully returned the letter to the envelope, tucked the architectural diagram into his jacket, and guided Connor back through the mill toward the exit. The building felt different now, not abandoned but dormant, like something waiting to reveal its secrets to someone willing to listen. Every shadow held possibility, every structural detail potential significance. As they emerged into the parking lot, the sun was setting over the wheat fields, painting them in shades of copper and bronze. James looked back at the mill, at 4 stories of limestone and history and hidden fortune, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with terror, dangerous and exhilarating in equal measure. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife, Melissa, asking when she could expect this month's child support. He'd been avoiding her calls for weeks, had no answer that wouldn't sound like excuses or lies. But now, standing in front of a building that supposedly contained a grain magnate's treasure, James had something he could work toward, a direction even if the destination was unclear. He texted back, "Working on something. We'll call soon." Connor climbed into their truck, buckling himself with the practiced efficiency of a child who'd learned early to take care of himself, and James sat in the driver's seat with Whitmore's map spread across the steering wheel. The architectural diagram showed the mill in precise detail, every floor plan, every structural element. The red markings indicated specific locations, 8 of them total, each annotated with measurements and what appeared to be clues. One notation read, "Where grain first entered, seek the cornerstone blessed by harvest." Another said, "In the grinding chamber's heart, beneath the primary roller, the foundation remembers." The clues were maddeningly vague and tantalizingly specific at the same time. James started the truck, knowing he needed to find somewhere for them to sleep tonight, but his mind was already working through the puzzle. A grain magnate's fortune hidden in a condemned mill, protected by riddles and architectural secrets. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of desperate gamble that a man with $460 and a son to protect might just be crazy enough to pursue. As he pulled out of the lot, James made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would solve Augustus Whitmore's puzzle, find whatever the old man had hidden, and transform their desperate situation into something resembling stability. The mill had been sold for almost nothing because everyone assumed it was worth exactly that. But James knew better now. Sometimes the most valuable things were the ones everyone else had stopped looking for. The building receded in his rearview mirror, for stories of possibility against the darkening Montana sky, and James Harding drove toward an uncertain night with a map to hidden treasure folded in his pocket and the weight of impossible hope settling in his chest like grain too heavy to carry but too valuable to abandon. James spent their first night in the mill illegally, spreading sleeping bags on the cleanest section of the 4th floor office. Connor curled against him while wind whistled through broken windows and carried the scent of wheat chaff and decay. The building creaked around them like something alive, timber contracting in the cooling night, old equipment settling under weight it had carried for a century. Every sound made James question his sanity, but morning came anyway, pale light filtering through grain-dusty windows, and Connor woke asking what was for breakfast with the resilient hope of children who still believed their parents had plans. They ate gas station donuts and drank water from a bottle James had filled at a rest stop, and he studied Whitmore's map while Connor explored the office with instructions not to touch anything that looked unstable, which was essentially everything. The first marked location referenced where grain first entered, seek the cornerstone blessed by harvest. James knew enough about mill operations to understand that meant the receiving area, the ground floor section where farmers had delivered their wheat before it was elevated to storage bins. The cornerstone was massive, carved limestone inscribed with the mill's founding date and Whitmore's name in letters that had weathered a century of Montana seasons. James examined the foundation carefully, running his hands over the surface, searching for anything that felt loose or deliberately altered. The stone was solid, immovable, and after an hour of searching he found nothing except dirty hands and the growing certainty that he'd misunderstood the clue. He was still searching when his phone rang, Melissa's name on the screen. James almost didn't answer, but avoiding her had never made anything better, only postponed the inevitable collision. "Where are you?" Melissa's voice carried the particular edge she reserved for conversations about his failures. "I called your landlord. He says you moved out without leaving a forwarding address. We're fine. I found a place." "What place?" "James, you're 4 months behind on support, you haven't had a job in 2 months, and now you've moved without telling me? I could take this to the judge." I said we're fine. "Where's Connor?" "He's supposed to be in school." James looked up at the dusty ceiling, imagining his son directly above him, coloring in a condemned building that could collapse at any moment. "He's with me. We're working on something." "Working on what?" "You don't have work. You haven't had real work since the dealership closed." Melissa's voice cracked slightly, anger giving way to something that might have been genuine concern. "I'm not trying to be cruel. But you need to face reality. If you can't provide stable housing and proper care, maybe Connor should stay with me and Derek for a while." The words hit like a physical blow. Melissa had remarried 8 months ago, moved into Derek's house with its irrigated lawn and its school district rated excellent. She could provide everything James couldn't: stability, resources, a future that didn't depend on finding a dead man's hidden fortune. And courts favored stability, favored mothers, favored anything that looked more secure than a single father living illegally in a condemned flour mill. "No," James said, the word coming out harder than he intended. "He stays with me." "Then prove you can take care of him. Stable housing, regular income, proper schooling. You have 1 week, James. After that, I'm filing for emergency custody modification." The call ended, and James sat among the grain debris with 1 week to transform his life from desperate gamble into something that looked like responsible parenting. He could sell the mill, probably get a few thousand for the salvage rights, use that to rent something acceptable and buy time. But selling meant giving up on Whitmore's fortune, meant accepting that he'd spent his last dollars on a fantasy. He climbed back upstairs to find Connor standing at the window, looking down at the parking lot where a truck had pulled in, its logo identifying it as belonging to Henderson Demolition and Salvage. 2 men were examining the building's exterior, one taking photographs while the other pointed at structural damage visible even from the ground. "Who are they, Dad?" "I don't know." "Stay here." James descended quickly, emerging from the mill's entrance as the 2 men finished their inspection. The one with the camera looked up, surprised to see anyone. "You the new owner?" he asked. "I am." "James Harding." "Carl Henderson." The man didn't offer to shake hands. "County hired us to assess demolition viability. They're considering bringing this building down, figured the new owner probably wouldn't have resources to rehabilitate it properly." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. "When?" "Assessments due end of the week. If they decide to proceed, you'd get 30 days notice before we start work." Henderson gestured at the building. "No offense, but looking at the condition, I can't see you wanting to save it. Foundation's questionable, roof's failing, probably contamination throughout. Demolition's the responsible choice. I haven't decided what I'm doing with it yet." Henderson shrugged. "Your call. But county's going to require either a viable rehabilitation plan with licensed contractors or they'll exercise condemnation authority for public safety. Can't have a 4-story building collapse in town." He handed James a business card. "When you're ready to discuss salvage rights and demolition costs, give me a call." They left, and James stood in the parking lot with Henderson's card in his hand and the weight of impossible choices pressing down. 1 week from Melissa, 30 days from the county, and between them the reality that he was living in a condemned building with his son, searching for a fortune that might not exist beyond the letter he'd found. He spent the rest of the day searching for the first cache location, rereading Whitmore's clue about the cornerstone blessed by harvest. Maybe it wasn't about the physical cornerstone but about the blessing itself, about the ritual farmers performed when delivering their first harvest. James remembered his grandfather talking about such traditions, how farmers would mark the season's beginning with small ceremonies, sometimes leaving tokens or offerings. He returned to the receiving area and examined the space differently, looking not at the stone but at what surrounded it. The wooden loading platform showed where patterns from decades of trucks and wagons, but in one corner, protected by an overhang, the wood was less weathered. James knelt and examined the boards carefully, pressing and testing until one shifted under his hand. Beneath the loose board was a cavity, and in that cavity was a metal box roughly the size of a bread loaf, its surface engraved with wheat stalks and the date 1891. Inside were gold coins, dozens of them, pre-1920 double eagles that James recognized from a brief interest in numismatics during better times when he'd had the luxury of hobbies. His hands shook as he counted them. 38 coins, each potentially worth thousands depending on condition and rarity. This wasn't fantasy anymore. This was real wealth, enough to satisfy Melissa's lawyer and the county's requirements, enough to prove he could provide for Connor. James sat in the dusty receiving area with a fortune in his lap and felt tears threatening for the first time since Melissa had left, taking her certainty and leaving him with a custody arrangement that felt like managed defeat. He was still sitting there when he heard footsteps above him, heavy and deliberate. James froze, listening as someone moved through the upper floors. He'd locked the entrance, was certain of it, which meant whoever was up there had found another way in. James quickly closed the box and climbed the stairs, moving quietly, his mind racing through possibilities. The footsteps came from the third floor, from the laboratory area. He approached slowly, peering around the doorframe to see a man in his 70s examining the old equipment with the careful attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. "Can I help you?" James said, stepping into view. The man turned, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting company. He was lean and weathered, with the particular stillness that suggested military or law enforcement background. "You must be Harding." "I'm Walter Whitmore. Augustus was my grandfather." James's mind raced, calculating implications. "I bought this property legally. County auction, paid in full." "I'm aware. I'm the one who stopped fighting the tax seizure." Walter moved closer, his eyes scanning the laboratory, the equipment James had already examined. "My family's been trying to unload this place for 30 years. Tax burden, maintenance impossibility, contamination liability. But my father, Augustus's son, he always insisted we keep it. Said there were obligations, things that mattered, family responsibilities. He died 8 months ago, and I finally convinced my siblings to let it go. So what do you want?" "To know what you found." Walter gestured at the dusty laboratory equipment. "My grandfather was a complicated man. Built a fortune during the agricultural boom, supposedly lost it in the crash, then somehow rebuilt through methods that were never entirely clear. Stories passed down through the family about money hidden in the mill, treasures secured against uncertainty. But if they existed, we never found them. Searched this place thoroughly over the years." James kept his expression neutral. "It's just an old mill. Broken equipment and grain dust." "But not only that." Walter's expression hardened. "I can see it in your face, the way you're standing. You found something valuable. And legally speaking, there's a legitimate question about whether treasures hidden by the original owner belong to the building's new purchaser or to the original owner's heirs. I bought the building and everything in it. That's how property sales work. Unless the items were concealed with intent to defraud creditors or hidden in ways that suggest they weren't part of the building's intrinsic value." Walter pulled out his phone. "I have a lawyer who specializes in estate disputes. We can do this cooperatively, split whatever you found, or we can do it through courts while you try to explain to Child Protective Services why you're raising a son in a condemned building." The threat was clear, and James felt the familiar rage that came from being cornered by people with more resources. But beneath the rage was calculation, the survivor's arithmetic he'd learned through years of barely managing. "Your grandfather left a letter," James said finally. Hidden in his office. Locations marked throughout the building where he stashed valuables. I've found one cache so far. Gold coins. There are 7 more marked on his map. Walter's careful composure cracked slightly, showing hunger beneath. Show me. They climbed to the 4th floor, Connor watching warily from the office doorway as James spread Whitmore's architectural diagram on the desk. Walter studied it with the intensity of someone seeing prayers answered, his finger tracing the red markings, reading the cryptic notations. He actually did it, Walter said quietly. The old bastard actually hid his fortune in the structure. He looked up at James. Here's what I propose. We search together, split what we find 60-40. I get the larger share because it was my grandfather's wealth, but you get enough to make this worth your effort. 50-50 or I do it myself. You don't have time to do it yourself. Demolition company's already been here, county's breathing down your neck, and your ex-wife's one phone call away from taking your son. You need money fast, and you need help navigating the legal complications. Walter's expression softened slightly. I'm not trying to rob you, Harding. I'm offering partnership when I could just as easily make your life hell through legal channels. James looked at his son, at the sleeping bags in the corner that constituted their current home, at the impossible situation he'd bought for $460. Walter Whitmore had resources, had connections, could probably smooth over complications James didn't even fully understand yet. But partnership also meant splitting the fortune, meant giving up control, meant trusting someone whose grandfather had been cunning enough to hide wealth for 70 years. 60-40 in my favor, James said finally. My building, my discovery, my risk. Walter considered, then nodded. Agreed. But we start now. Every day that passes is a day the county could condemn this place or your ex-wife could file for custody. They worked through the afternoon and into evening, following Whitmore's map to the remaining marked locations. The second cache was behind a false panel in the miller's office on the 2nd floor, containing more gold coins and a collection of bearer bonds from the 1930s. The third was in a hollowed-out section of the primary roller mechanism, accessible only by partial disassembly of equipment that had been still for decades, and held platinum bars stamped with pre-war assay marks. The 4th location nearly killed them both. It was marked on the map as being in the sub-basement, the lowest level of the mill where the original water wheel had been housed before steam power made it obsolete. The space was partially flooded, water black and stagnant, and James had to wade through it in darkness while Walter held a light from the stairs. The cache was in a waterproof safe embedded in the foundation wall, and getting it open required bolt cutters and a level of reckless determination that felt like madness. Inside were stacks of currency, old bills that looked like they belonged in museums, and documents that appeared to be property deeds and mineral rights certificates. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in Depression-era wealth, preserved in waterproof containers and forgotten by everyone except the man who'd hidden them. Dawn was breaking when they hauled the last box up from the sub-basement, both men exhausted and soaked, and James realized Connor had fallen asleep in the office, curled under blankets James had arranged. Walter sat on the floor surrounded by their discoveries, doing calculations on his phone, his face showing the kind of shock that comes from finding out family legends were true. Conservative estimate, we're looking at $700,000 to $900,000, Walter said. The gold alone is worth close to $250,000, the platinum another $150,000, and the bonds and deeds could be worth more depending on current markets and property values. James did his own math. 60% of $700,000 was $420,000. More money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to secure custody of Connor, rehabilitate the mill properly, build something sustainable. But Walter had said conservative estimate, and there were still 4 locations on the map they hadn't searched. What about the rest? James asked. Walter looked at the map again, his expression troubled. One of them references the grain elevator. Problem is, the elevator's structural integrity is completely compromised. Been condemned longer than the mill itself. Going up there would be genuinely dangerous. And the others? 2 of them are vague, just reference where the founder rested and beneath the blessing of abundance. Could mean anything. The fourth is more specific, talks about the Miller's House Foundation, but that structure was demolished in the 1960s. James took the map, studying notations his exhausted mind could barely process. The handwriting was shakier in some places, as if Whitmore had written different sections at different stages of life. There was a date beside the grain elevator notation, August 1953, the year before his death according to the portrait's caption. What if he meant it literally? Where he physically rested, his office, his desk. They climbed back to the fourth floor, to Whitmore's executive office with its portrait and its desk that James had already searched once. But beneath didn't just mean the hidden compartment in the floor where he'd found the letter. Beneath also meant under the desk itself, under the furniture, under the obvious. Walter helped him examine the desk's underside, and there, fixed to the wood with ancient glue, was an envelope. Inside was another letter, Whitmore's handwriting even shakier than the map notations. To the finder of my fortune, you have proven persistent and worthy of what you've discovered. But know this, all wealth carries weight. I built this mill with ambition that often overshadowed compassion, paid farmers prices that enriched me while leaving them struggling, turned grain into profit while the people who grew it lived on margins too thin. The money you've found is stained with that history, and if you take it without understanding what it cost others, you'll carry that stain too. The final caches are in the grain elevator and beneath the Miller's House Foundation, but reaching them requires risking everything. Consider carefully whether wealth is worth that price. Consider carefully what you'll build with money earned through another man's calculations. The choice, as with all moral choices, is yours alone. James read the letter twice, then handed it to Walter, who read it with an expression that shifted from confusion to something like grief. He never talked like this, Walter said quietly. Grandfather was always just a successful businessman, the man who built an empire from grain. Nobody mentioned the farmers he squeezed or the prices he manipulated. James thought about his own grandfather who'd farmed wheat his whole life, whose harvest checks had been determined by mill owners like Whitmore, who'd died with more debt than assets despite working land for 50 years. Wealth built on their backs, hidden away while their families struggled with commodity prices rigged in favor of processors. We don't have to go to the elevator, Walter said. We have enough. More than enough. But James was already moving toward the stairs that led to the roof access, not because he needed more money, though he did, but because Augustus Whitmore had left a challenge, had posed a moral question about whether someone desperate enough to risk everything was also brave enough to face what that desperation revealed. The grain elevator rose from the mill's north side, a concrete cylinder that had stored thousands of bushels before structural cracks made it unsafe. A ladder ran up the exterior, rungs that shifted under James's weight as he climbed. Walter called up warnings that James ignored, Connor's voice joining from below, begging Dad to come down, it's not safe. The elevator's top access hatch was rusted partially open, and when James worked it wider and descended inside using a rope he'd brought, he found himself in a space that smelled like fermentation and decay. Old grain had rotted in the bottom, creating a layer of organic sludge, but high on the wall, wedged between reinforcing bars, was a box larger than all the others. When James worked it free and opened it, he found not more gold or bonds, but something different entirely, ledgers showing how Whitmore had systematically manipulated grain prices, paid farmers below market rates while selling their wheat at premiums, used weighing scales calibrated to short-change deliveries. Evidence of systematic exploitation that had funded the fortune James had been so eager to claim. He climbed back up with the box feeling heavier than it should, and descended the ladder to find Walter and Connor waiting. James spread the documents on the ground while they watched, showing the truth behind the treasure, every gold coin bought with farmers' stolen value, every bond purchased with profits extracted from people who had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered. We can destroy these, Walter said quietly. Nobody needs to know. But James was thinking about his own grandfather, about all the farmers whose names were in those ledgers, about the kind of man who would hide treasure for 70 years but also hide the evidence of how he'd earned it. About what it meant to take that money knowing where it came from, and whether accepting wealth built on exploitation made you complicit in that exploitation. The sun was fully up now, morning light flooding the parking lot, and James Harding sat outside a condemned flour mill with more money than he'd ever imagined and a choice that money alone couldn't answer. 1 week until Melissa filed for custody. 30 days until the county made their decision. And in his hands, evidence that the fortune he'd found was built on the suffering of people like his grandfather, people who'd worked land and grown wheat and been systematically robbed by the very mills that should have been their partners. Connor sat beside him, 9 years old and watching his father with the particular intensity children develop when they sense adults are wrestling with questions that have no easy answers. And James understood that whatever choice he made now would teach his son more about integrity than any words he could offer, would define not just their immediate future but the kind of man Connor learned to become. James spent 3 days cataloging everything they'd found, photographing documents and valuables, creating an inventory that felt less like treasure hunting and more like accounting for debts that could never be fully settled. Walter helped, his initial excitement turning to something heavier as they worked through the evidence of his grandfather's systematic price manipulation. The ledgers showed farmers paid 60 cents on the dollar for wheat that Whitmore then sold at full market rates, weighing scales calibrated to register 5% less than actual delivery, quality downgrades applied arbitrarily to justify price reductions. "My father must have known," Walter said on the third evening, sitting in the office that had belonged to his grandfather. "He fought so hard to keep this building, insisted there were family obligations we needed to honor. I thought he meant treasure, but maybe he meant something else. Maybe he was trying to keep the evidence buried along with the gold." James had been thinking about that too, about the difference between hiding wealth and hiding shame, about whether Augustus Whitmore's final letter had been confession or challenge or some combination of both. The old man had left enough clues to ensure his fortune would eventually be found, but he'd also ensured that whoever found it would have to confront exactly what that fortune represented. Melissa called on the fourth day, her voice carrying the rehearsed precision of someone who'd been coached by lawyers. "I'm filing the custody modification petition tomorrow unless you can demonstrate stable housing, documented income, and appropriate educational arrangements for Connor. That's the requirement, James. Prove you can provide or accept that he deserves better." "I need 1 more week," James said, looking out the office window at Cottonwood Creek that had once powered this mill's water wheel, at water that kept flowing regardless of human drama. "You've had 2 months since you lost your job. How many more weeks do you need?" "1. Melissa was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice carried less courtroom steel and more genuine exhaustion. "I don't want to take him from you. I want you to succeed, to be the father he needs. But I can't watch you drown and let him go under with you." The call ended, and James sat with his phone in his hand in a week to transform his life into something that looked like stability from the outside while feeling like collapse from within. He'd found a fortune built on exploiting farmers, had partnered with the heir of the man who'd done the exploiting, and now faced a choice that had been growing in his mind since reading Whitmore's final letter: take the money and build something new, or acknowledge its source in ways that might cost him everything. That night, after Connor had fallen asleep in his nest of blankets, James took the price manipulation ledgers and spread them across Whitmore's desk. The names of farmers, dates of delivery, amounts stolen through calculated underpayment. Hundreds of people over decades, systematic theft that had funded gold coins and bearer bonds, and the wealth that was supposed to save James's life. He pulled out his phone and started searching for descendants, for anyone who might still carry the names listed in Whitmore's exploitation records. Walter found him at 2 a.m, still searching, notes covering every surface. "What are you doing?" "Finding people we owe." "You can't be serious. Those farmers have been dead for 70 years, and most of them probably have no traceable descendants. You'd spend the entire fortune trying to make restitution for something that happened before either of us was born. So we just keep it. Pretend we don't know where it came from." Edward sat down heavily, his face showing the strain of 4 days spent excavating family shame. "My grandfather was a product of his time. The exploitation he practiced was standard across every mill in Montana. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it systemic. You can't fix systemic injustice with individual restitution. But we can acknowledge it. We can use this money in ways that wouldn't just benefit us. How? James hadn't fully formed the idea yet, but it had been building since he'd first read the price manipulation documents, since he'd understood that the fortune he'd found was built on the labor of people who looked like his own grandfather. The mill. We rehabilitate it, but not as luxury apartments or commercial storage. We turn it into something that serves the agricultural community that was exploited to build it. Grain cooperative maybe, or farmers market space, or processing facility that pays fair prices. Something that generates value for people who need it rather than extracting it from them. That's idealistic. Probably not even financially viable. Neither is keeping a condemned building, but I did it anyway. Walter was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents spread across the desk. My grandfather's letter said wealth carries weight. He knew that, lived with it, and it probably ate at him his whole life. That's why he had everything, left these riddles. He wanted someone to find the fortune, but he also wanted them to understand what it cost. You think he was asking for forgiveness? I think he was asking someone to do better than he did. To take what he'd accumulated through exploitation and transform it into something that wasn't. Walter picked up one of the ledgers, reading names from 70 years ago. My share of the fortune, I'll put it toward the rehabilitation. Make it a proper partnership focused on community benefit, not just treasure hunters splitting loot. James felt something shift, the impossible weight of the past 4 days settling into something that resembled a path forward. Not a clear path, not an easy one, but one that acknowledged what had been while building toward what might be. They spent the next week working with attorneys who specialized in agricultural law and historic property, establishing a cooperative structure that protected the found assets while designating their use for farming community benefit. The gold coins and platinum bars would be sold through legitimate channels, the bonds cashed where possible, and the property deeds researched to determine current value. The total came to just over $800,000 once everything was liquidated properly, and the legal structure they created designated 70% for mill rehabilitation and cooperative programming, with the remaining 30% split between James and Walter for immediate needs. James's share, roughly $120,000, was enough to rent a proper house, pay Melissa everything he owed, and establish a small account for living expenses while he managed the mill project. It wasn't the fortune he'd imagined when first finding Whitmore's map, but it was security, the kind of financial breathing room he hadn't experienced since before Connor was born. Melissa came to see the mill on the day the first contractors arrived to assess rehabilitation costs, her expression moving from skepticism to cautious surprise as James walked her through the plans. The architect they'd hired, a man named Robert Chen who specialized in agricultural building preservation, had designed a renovation that maintained the building's milling character while creating spaces for farmer cooperatives, grain storage at fair rates, and a processing facility that would pay market prices rather than the exploitative rates Whitmore had used. You did this in a week? Melissa asked, examining the detailed plans spread across a folding table in what would eventually be the cooperative's community space. Had help. And motivation. James showed her the legal documents, the financial projections, the letters of interest from farming families who'd been paying premium rates to corporate processors. The building's still condemned, but we've got permits to begin rehabilitation and a timeline that gets us operational within 2 years. And where are you living now? We've rented a house outside town. 3-bedroom, near Connor's school. First and last month's rent paid from my share of the discovery as compensation for property management during rehabilitation. Melissa studied him, searching for the desperate edge that had characterized their last several conversations. You look different. Less like you're barely holding on. I was barely holding on. Then I bought a condemned mill and found a reason to build something that matters. She didn't fight the custody arrangement, didn't file the modification petition, and when she left, she stopped in the parking lot to tell James something she'd probably been holding for months. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I couldn't watch you stop believing you deserved better. Whatever you found in this building, I hope it included that. The rehabilitation took longer than projected, cost more than budgeted, and required compromise on nearly every decision. The roof needed complete replacement, not just repair. The foundation required reinforcement that meant excavating around the entire perimeter. Environmental remediation for grain dust and potential mold consumed months and tens of thousands of dollars. But slowly, incrementally, the mill transformed from ruins to possibility. Walter surprised James by becoming genuinely invested in the project, attending contractor meetings and farmer cooperative forums, learning about agricultural economics and fair trade practices. They argued constantly about priorities and budgets, about whether to preserve original equipment as functional machinery or convert it to museum displays, about how much gentrification risk they were creating by making the building too attractive to outside investors. "My grandfather built wealth by exploiting farmers," Walter said during one particularly heated discussion about membership criteria for the cooperative. "If we fill this space with corporate AG operations and commodity speculators, we're just doing the same thing with better marketing." They established criteria that prioritized family farms, multi-generational operations, and processors who committed to transparent pricing. The grain storage facility, funded through grants they'd spent months applying for, charged rates based on actual costs rather than market manipulation. And in a corner of the main floor, they created a small museum documenting the mill's history, including the price manipulation ledgers and Whitmore's final letter, acknowledging the exploitation that had funded the building's construction and operation. Connor turned 10 during the first year of rehabilitation, celebrated his birthday in a building still under construction, his friends climbing scaffolding and exploring spaces that were becoming something new. James watched his son navigate the mill with the confidence of belonging, pointing out features and explaining the building's transformation to his classmates, and realized Connor was learning lessons about legacy and responsibility he'd never had the chance to learn at that age. The grand reopening happened on a September afternoon 18 months after James had bought the mill for $460. 200 people attended, including farming families and their descendants, county officials who'd threatened demolition, and community members who'd watched the building decay for decades. Robert Chin had designed the entrance to preserve the original grain receiving area while creating a dramatic welcome space, and someone had found the mill's original bell, restored it, and rehung it in the tower. James stood on the main floor, surrounded by equipment that was now both functional and historical, by spaces that would house cooperative storage and processing and educational programs about agricultural economics. He felt the particular satisfaction that comes from building something that wouldn't have existed without desperation and luck and the willingness to risk everything on a condemned building. Walter found him near the museum display, where visitors were reading Augustus Whitmore's documents with expressions ranging from shock to recognition. "Strange feeling, isn't it? Making a monument to your grandfather's exploitation. Better than hiding it," James said. "That's what he did, and it poisoned everything. You think acknowledging changes anything? I think it's the starting point. Everything else we build here, it's built on that acknowledgement." The Whitmore Grain Cooperative opened with 15 member farms, 2 processing operations, and storage capacity that served the surrounding agricultural community at rates determined by actual costs rather than profit maximization. Revenue from operations covered maintenance and generated modest surplus that went back into programming and education, creating a sustainable model that other regions started studying for their own abandoned mills. James took a position as facility manager, drawing a salary that covered rent and Connor's expenses and slowly rebuilt his savings. The work was constant, coordinating between farmers and processors, maintaining century-old equipment alongside new technology, solving problems that ranged from mechanical failures to membership disputes. But it was work that meant something beyond simple survival, contribution to something that would outlast him. Melissa's marriage to Derek ended after 18 months, friendly enough that she moved into a smaller house nearby and offered to take Connor more often to give James time for himself. He declined mostly, jealous of the days he had with his son, but accepted occasionally when mill emergencies required late nights or early mornings. The custody arrangement evolved into something collaborative rather than contentious, and sometimes Melissa came to cooperative events, supporting what James had built even if she'd never be part of it. Walter became an unlikely friend, his initial treasure-hunting enthusiasm transforming into genuine commitment to the cooperative's mission. He funded a scholarship program for farming families' children and established an endowment that would support operations when the initial capital eventually ran out. His grandfather's portrait still hung in what was now the administrative office, but they'd added context, a plaque explaining Augustus Whitmore's role in the mill's history without glorifying the methods he'd used to build his fortune. On the 2-year anniversary of the cooperative's opening, James stood at the top of the grain elevator, now fully restored and converted to an observation deck open to members. The wheat fields stretched out below, gold and green depending on the season, and Cottonwood Creek wound through the landscape carrying water that had powered this building once and would continue flowing long after the mill crumbled again. Connor climbed up to join him, 11 years old now and tall enough to see over the railing without help. "Mom says you made something good out of something bad." "That's one way to look at it. What's the other way?" James considered the question, looking out at the land that had sustained his grandfather and been exploited by men like Whitmore, at the community that had been built on wheat farming and was now building itself into something more sustainable. "The other way is that good and bad get complicated when you dig deep enough. The man who built this place did terrible things to farmers, but he also created a processing facility that kept the local economy going. The money he hid was stolen through manipulation, but finding it gave us a chance to build something that serves farmers instead of exploiting them. Using it to create the cooperative doesn't erase where it came from, but it creates something that might help families he hurt." "So it's both? Good and bad at the same time?" "Most important things are." They descended as the sun set over the wheat fields, the mill's windows reflecting light that had traveled across the universe to illuminate limestone laid 100 years ago. The building hummed with activity, farmers delivering grain and processors working and people learning about agricultural economics in spaces that had been empty ruins when James first walked through them with $460 and no plan beyond desperate hope. The milling equipment that remained stood as monument and reminder, rollers that had crushed wheat 24 hours a day under Whitmore's ownership now operating under cooperative principles, processing grain at rates determined by actual costs rather than profit maximization. Visitors came to see them, to understand that agricultural history wasn't just innovation and productivity but exploitation and struggle, that the buildings we preserve carry stories we're obligated to remember even when remembering is uncomfortable. James locked the mill's main entrance each evening, a ritual he performed personally rather than delegating, checking that spaces were secure and systems functioning. The building groaned sometimes, old timbers settling, limestone expanding and contracting with temperature changes, sounds that had once seemed threatening but now felt familiar. He'd learned its rhythms, knew which noises meant problems and which were just the building breathing. His house was 15 minutes away, close enough to reach quickly if emergencies arose, and Connor had learned to fall asleep to occasional late-night calls about equipment failures or delivery scheduling conflicts. They'd created a life that wasn't perfect or secure or anything like what Melissa had built with Derek, but it was theirs, constructed from ruins and found fortune and the particular resilience that comes from learning you can survive falling and still manage to stand. On nights when James couldn't sleep, he'd return to the mill, let himself in through the side entrance, and walk the floors they'd renovated. The spaces felt different in darkness, more like the building he'd first purchased, shadows and possibility mixed together. He'd think about Augustus Whitmore, about a man who'd built wealth on exploiting farmers and hidden it in walls, about whether that final letter had been apology or test or simply honesty about the weight all fortunes carry. The museum display included a guest book where visitors could leave reflections, and James read it sometimes, looking for patterns in what people wrote. Some comments were angry, condemnation of Whitmore's practices and all the grain processors who'd built fortunes through manipulation. Others were more reflective, noting how little had changed, how modern agricultural economics still favored processors over producers. A few understood what James and Walter had tried to create: acknowledgement without excuse, transformation without erasure, using exploitation's profits to build something that served farmers rather than extracting from them. 5 years after buying the mill, James received a letter from descendants of farmers named in Whitmore's price manipulation ledgers, people whose great-grandparents had been systematically underpaid. They'd learned about the museum display, had visited the cooperative, and wanted to thank James for acknowledging what had happened to their families. The letter included photographs of the farmers, images James had never seen, faces behind the names in Whitmore's ledgers. He added the photos to the museum display, creating a memorial wall that honored the farmers whose labor had built the mill and funded the fortune that ultimately paid for its rehabilitation. The wall grew over months as more descendants came forward, contributing photographs and stories, creating an archive that documented wheat farming from perspectives that had rarely been preserved. Walter stood with James at the wall's dedication ceremony, looking at faces that included people his grandfather had exploited. "I spent my whole life proud of being a Whitmore, of coming from someone who'd built something significant. Now I don't know what to be proud of." "Be proud that you didn't hide it," James said. "That you helped build this." He gestured at the mill, at the cooperative operations and educational programs that filled spaces where grain had once been processed for profit maximization. "Your grandfather built this place through exploitation. We're rebuilding it through acknowledgement. That's not redemption, but it's something." The cooperative continued operating, not dramatically profitable but sustainably, generating enough revenue to maintain the building and support programming while serving farming families at fair rates. James turned 40 managing a building he'd owned for 8 years, surrounded by people who'd built businesses and livelihoods in spaces he'd helped create. The roof needed replacement again, the second time since renovation, and James signed contracts with the weary competence born of experience rather than panic. Melissa attended his birthday celebration, her life having taken paths James didn't fully understand but respected, and told him something he'd never expected to hear: "You were right about this place. I didn't see it at first, thought you were being reckless and irresponsible. But you built something that matters more than safety." The mill stood solid through seasons and storms, through commodity price fluctuations and agricultural policy changes, through the constant challenge of maintaining a century-old building while keeping it relevant to contemporary farming. James added solar panels to supplement power costs, updated processing equipment as technology evolved, modified spaces as the cooperative's needs changed. The building adapted the way successful structures do, maintaining essential character while incorporating necessary change. On the 10th anniversary of his purchase, James climbed to the observation deck as he had on opening day, on countless days since, and looked out at the wheat fields that had sustained this region for generations. The land stretched to the horizon, gold with approaching harvest, and James could see combines working in the distance, bringing in grain that would be stored and processed at fair rates in the building behind him. Below, the mill hummed with evening activity, lights illuminating windows that had been broken when he'd first walked through them with Connor's hand in his and $460 in his pocket. The fortune he'd found was gone now, spent on rehabilitation and programming and the constant cost of keeping old buildings functional. But what remained was structure, purpose, community, proof that sometimes desperation leads to discovery and discovery leads to obligation and obligation leads to building something worth maintaining. Connor had started college, studying agricultural economics, planning to return and help manage the cooperative after graduation. He visited monthly, bringing friends to see the mill and telling them his father's story about buying a condemned building with his last money and finding a grain magnate's fortune hidden in the walls. The story had become legend, simplified and dramatic, and James let it stand that way because the truth was more complicated than anyone wanted to hear. That fortune was burden, that inheritance meant choosing what to carry and what to transform, that legacy was built through countless small decisions rather than dramatic moments. The bell rang for evening closing, its voice carrying across the wheat fields as it had for 100 years, calling workers home in one era and marking time in another. James descended from the observation deck, locked doors, checked systems, performed rituals that had become muscle memory through years of repetition. The building settled around him, timbers creaking, stone holding weight it had held for a century and would hold for decades more if someone cared enough to maintain it. He drove home through streets where grain trucks still rumbled during harvest, past fields that had replaced some crops with others but remained fundamentally agricultural, carrying weight that had become familiar through years of bearing it. The mill stood behind him, solid against the darkening sky, and James Harding understood what he'd bought for $460, not treasure or security or salvation, but responsibility, the obligation to build something from ruins that acknowledged where it came from while reaching toward what it might become. The heart attack came on a Tuesday morning in late summer, 20 years after James had first walked through the mill's entrance with nothing but desperation and a child's hand in his. The doctor used words like significant damage and lifestyle modification, gave instructions about stress reduction and medication schedules, and James sat in the examination room thinking not about mortality but about who would maintain the mill's boiler system and whether Connor knew where the emergency shut-off valves were located. Connor came from the university where he now taught agricultural economics, brought his wife Sarah with him, and they sat in James's house that overlooked the wheat fields, the mill visible through windows that framed it like a portrait he'd been studying for 2 decades. Connor didn't cry the way he had at 9 when they'd slept in a condemned building, but his face showed the particular fear adults feel when they realize their parents aren't permanent. The cooperative needs someone who understands why it matters, James said when the initial shock had settled enough for conversation. Not just how to run operations, but why we built it the way we did. I have a job, Dad. A position I worked years to get. I can't just abandon that and move back to manage a grain mill. I'm not asking you to abandon anything. I'm asking you to consider what you want to be responsible for. James gestured toward the window, toward the mill standing solid against the summer sky. That building is going to outlast both of us. The question is what it becomes after I'm gone, whether it stays true to what we built or just becomes another processing facility maximizing profit. Sarah, who'd been quiet until now, spoke with the careful tone of someone navigating family dynamics she understood but wasn't born into. What did you build? I know it's a farmers' cooperative, but what was the deeper purpose? James considered the question, searching for words that would explain 20 years of decisions and compromise and constant negotiation between ideals and reality. We built acknowledgement. The mill was constructed and operated through exploitation, funded by manipulating farmers who had no choice but to accept whatever prices were offered. Everyone just accepted that as history, as something that happened and couldn't be changed. We changed it by admitting what it was and trying to build something different in the same space. The purpose was proving that legacy doesn't have to be destiny. The recovery took months, during which James watched the mill's daily operations from a distance that felt like exile. Connor and Sarah moved back gradually, Connor taking a reduced teaching load while learning the cooperative systems, and James documented institutional knowledge he'd accumulated through 2 decades of daily management, writing down things he'd never thought to record because they'd seemed too obvious or too small to matter. Walter visited weekly, now in his 90s and moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had become unreliable. He brought food James couldn't eat due to his new dietary restrictions and conversation that avoided the obvious reality that they were both facing mortality with the particular helplessness old men feel when their remaining time becomes countable. I've been thinking about my grandfather, Walter said during one visit, sitting in James's living room with the mill visible through windows that had become James's primary view of the world. Whether he knew someone would find his fortune and have to make the choices we made. Whether leaving that final letter was intentional moral instruction or just his guilt-finding expression. Does it matter? I think it does. If he planned it, if he deliberately structured the treasure hunt to force ethical reckoning, that's almost redemptive. If it was just coincidence, then his exploitation generated random consequences decades after his death. James looked at the mill, at limestone that had witnessed a century of agricultural cycles, that would continue witnessing long after both of them were dust. I think he knew someone would search. The letter he left, the way he structured the clues, it was designed to make the finder work hard enough to understand what they were taking. But I don't think he could have predicted what we'd do with it. How could he? He lived in a world where exploitation was just business practice. We live in one where we know better but still struggle to do better. Do you regret it? Taking the money, building the cooperative? I regret not teaching Connor the boiler maintenance procedure before the heart attack. That's going to be a disaster when it needs servicing. Walter smiled, but his eyes carried the weight of watching a friend fade. Connor's moving back permanently. He told me yesterday. Taking a full-time position as cooperative director, keeping the university role as adjunct faculty. Says he wants to make sure the place continues the way you built it. James felt something release in his chest, tension he'd been carrying since the diagnosis. Connor hadn't told him yet, was probably waiting for the right moment, but knowing he'd made that choice mattered more than James could articulate. Legacy would continue, not because James had demanded it but because Connor had chosen it, understood what the mill represented beyond grain processing and fair pricing. The cooperative held a celebration for its 20th anniversary in September, and James attended in a wheelchair, his body too weak for the walking that managing the mill had once required but his mind still sharp enough to appreciate the symmetry. Farmers spoke about fair pricing and transparent practices, about building businesses around the cooperative's operations, about opportunities that hadn't existed before the mill reopened. Some of them were grandchildren of farmers exploited by Augustus Whitmore, learning agricultural economics in spaces where their ancestors had been systematically cheated. One speaker, a man named Robert Peterson whose grandfather appeared in Whitmore's price manipulation ledgers, addressed James directly. "My family farmed wheat for 4 generations under Whitmore's pricing. They were paid below market rates, charged inflated storage fees, and died with more debt than assets despite working land their entire lives. When I first heard about this place reopening, I didn't want anything to do with it. Too much trauma, too much stolen value. But then I came and saw what you built, saw my grandfather's name honored instead of hidden, saw the exploitation acknowledged instead of erased. You didn't fix what happened, but you testified to it. That matters to families like mine." James listened and understood that this was the measure of success that truly mattered, not financial sustainability or building preservation but whether people whose ancestors had been harmed felt their pain was acknowledged rather than dismissed. The mill would outlast him, would continue serving the agricultural community or fail to, but for this moment it stood as testimony that exploitation could be named and legacy could be transformed. He died in March, as winter released its hold and the fields began showing the first green of winter wheat coming awake. Connor was with him, and Walter, and a hospice nurse who'd spent enough time in their company to understand the mill's significance. His last coherent words were about checking the grain elevator's moisture sensors, the mundane concerns of someone who'd spent 2 decades maintaining a building that mattered more than comfort or ease. The funeral filled the mill's community space with people whose lives had intersected with James's work, cooperative members and their families, university colleagues and students, county officials and community activists, Melissa with her quiet grief for the man she'd loved and left and ultimately respected. Connor spoke about his father's particular brand of stubborn idealism, his refusal to accept that buildings or systems or legacies couldn't change if someone cared enough to do the work. Walter delivered a eulogy that was really about Augustus Whitmore, about his grandfather's exploitation and James's transformation of it, about how sometimes justice looks less like punishment and more like acknowledgement, less like erasing history and more like building something different on top of it. My grandfather manipulated farmers to build a fortune he hid in these walls. James found that fortune and used it to build something those farmers' descendants could benefit from. That's not redemption, it's not full restitution, it's just honest accounting of debts we can never completely repay. They scattered James's ashes in the wheat fields that surrounded the mill, watching the wind carry him across land that had sustained this community for generations. Connor stood with Sarah beside him, Walter slightly apart, and they were quiet in the way people are when grief is too large for words but too important to ignore. The mill stood behind them, for stories of limestone and history and transformation, windows reflecting clouds that moved with the particular speed that suggests seasons changing. The building had weathered James's death the way it had weathered Augustus Whitmore's, the way it would weather Connor's eventual passing and everyone else's, because buildings persist when maintained, outlasting the people who claim to own them while really just temporarily stewarding them. Connor moved into his father's house, not because he needed the space but because the view of the mill felt important to maintain. He found James's notebooks documenting 20 years of maintenance decisions and community negotiations, discovered the complexity of systems his father had managed while making it look simpler than it was. The boiler did need servicing, Walter had been right about that, and the repair took weeks to coordinate through the cooperative's limited budget. The memorial wall grew after James's death, Not with more farmer photographs but with images of people who'd benefited from the cooperative, farm families who'd built sustainable businesses around fair pricing, students who'd learned agricultural economics through the mill's educational programs, processors who'd discovered that transparent practices could be profitable. The wall became less about documenting exploitation alone and more about showing transformation, how the same structure could serve different purposes depending on who controlled it and what values guided their decisions. Sarah took a position managing the cooperative's educational programming, her background in rural sociology aligning with the outreach they'd been trying to expand. She and Connor had a daughter they named Grace, after James's mother, and the child grew up treating the mill as extended home, playing in spaces that had once held equipment that had once exploited farmers who'd grown the wheat that had funded everything. Walter died at 94, quietly in his sleep, and left his entire estate to the cooperative's endowment with instructions that it be used for maintaining fair pricing practices and expanding farmer education. His will included a letter addressed to Connor that he read at Walter's memorial service. "My grandfather built wealth through exploitation. Your father transformed it through acknowledgement. I've tried to sustain it through investment and honesty. Now it's your generation's turn to decide what this building becomes next." Every generation has that choice, to continue harm or work toward repair. Choose repair. Always choose repair. The seasons turned, marking time in the particular way that matters to wheat farmers and old buildings, in cycles of planting and harvest that outlast individual human drama while being shaped by accumulated human decisions. The mill stood through droughts that tested the region's agricultural resilience, through commodity price crashes that destroyed some farms and forced others to adapt, through the constant entropy that claims all construction if someone doesn't care enough to maintain it. Connor cared enough. Marked 25 years of cooperative operation with an event that was really about James, about a man who'd bought a condemned building with his last money and refused to accept that legacy couldn't be transformed. He spoke to a crowd that included people who'd never met his father but understood what he'd built, about how desperation sometimes leads to discovery and discovery leads to responsibility and responsibility leads to building something worth maintaining. "My father found a grain magnate's fortune hidden in these walls," Connor said, standing where James had stood at the 20th anniversary. He could have taken that money and walked away, built a comfortable life somewhere else. Instead he chose to acknowledge where the fortune came from and use it to build something different here. That choice defined the rest of his life and shapes how we operate this cooperative today. We're not trying to erase history or pretend exploitation didn't happen. We're trying to build something honest on top of dishonest foundation, to create fairness in spaces built through denying it. The memorial wall had expanded to fill 2 sections of the museum space, photographs and stories documenting agricultural labor across generations, from Whitmore's exploited farmers through the cooperative's establishment to current members and their children. The wall showed continuity and transformation, how the same building could mean different things depending on who controlled it and how that control was exercised. Grace, now 12, led tours of the mill for school groups and visitors, explaining the equipment that remained both functional and historical, the architectural features that marked different eras of construction, the memorial wall that honored people who'd worked without being properly valued. She told her grandfather's story with the practiced ease of someone who'd heard it countless times, about buying a condemned building and finding hidden treasure and choosing to use it for community benefit rather than personal gain. Sometimes visitors asked if James had become wealthy from his discovery, if the fortune had secured his family's future. Grace's answer was always the same: he became wealthy in ways that matter. The building is still here, still serving farmers fairly, still acknowledging history while building towards something different. That's the fortune he left us. The wheat fields stretched beyond the mill in patterns that changed with each season, gold during harvest and green during growth and brown during winter rest. The land was patient, absorbing the efforts of each generation of farmers and processors, holding the nutrients and the mistakes in equal measure, waiting for spring to try again. Connor walked the perimeter of the mill property on autumn evenings when management duties allowed, following the fence line that James had maintained and he now maintained, past the grain elevator observation deck where his father had stood countless times looking out at the wheat that sustained his community. The building was visible from every point on the property, for stories of limestone against the changing sky, and Connor understood what his father had known, that buildings outlasted people but required people to maintain meaning. The milling equipment operated on schedules determined by harvest cycles and member needs, processing grain at rates that reflected actual costs rather than profit maximization. The cooperative served 43 member farms now, had expanded to include organic grain processing and specialty wheat varieties, had become a model that other regions studied for their own agricultural sustainability initiatives. Revenue covered operations and maintenance and generated modest surplus that funded scholarships for farming families' children and equipment upgrades that kept the facility competitive with corporate processors. Grace turned 16 and started working at the cooperative during summers, learning the business from the ground up the way Connor had learned from James. She asked questions about Augustus Whitmore, about why they kept his portrait and his name on the building if he'd done such terrible things. Connor's answer was the same one his father had given him, because pretending he didn't exist or that the exploitation didn't happen would be another kind of lie. The building was born from his ambition and his cruelty. We can't change that, but we can be honest about it while building something different now. The bell in the tower rang for shift changes and closing times, its voice carrying across the wheat fields as it had for over a century, and Connor locked doors his father had locked, checked systems James had maintained, performed rituals that had become tradition through decades of repetition. The building settled around him, timbers creaking with familiar voices, limestone holding heat from the day and releasing it slowly through the night. Outside, Cottonwood Creek reflected the last light of evening, carrying it downstream toward darkness that would give way to dawn that would bring another day of processing grain, of serving farmers, of honoring history while building toward futures that couldn't be fully predicted but could be shaped through choices made with intention and care. The mill breathed around him, patient and solid, waiting for whatever came next with the particular endurance that well-maintained structures possess. Connor Cross understood what his father had bought for $460, not treasure or security or salvation, but the opportunity to build something worth maintaining, to transform legacy through acknowledgement, to prove that sometimes the most valuable fortunes are the ones we build rather than the ones we find. The wheat fields darkened as night settled over Montana, and in the mill's windows, lights burned where farmers delivered grain and processors worked late, and the next generation learned that agriculture was about more than growing crops, about cycles of debt and fairness, about whether the systems we inherit can be transformed or whether we're doomed to repeat the patterns that came before. Connor climbed to the observation deck one final time before heading home, looked out at the land that had sustained his grandfather and been exploited by men like Whitmore and was now being worked by farmers who received fair value for their labor. The stars emerged above the wheat fields, constant and distant, and Connor thought about his father standing in this exact spot 25 years ago with $460 in his pocket and impossible hope in his chest. The mill stood behind him, solid and breathing, holding the weight of a century while preparing for the next, and Connor understood that legacy wasn't what you inherited but what you chose to carry forward, what you added, what you transformed from burden into something that might, if you worked hard enough and cared deeply enough, become something worth passing on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.